Hello and welcome to Sleep Science Galaxy. I'm truly glad you're listening, right in this very moment. Perhaps today has been a long day. Or perhaps you're someone who drifts more easily into sleep by imagining distant planets, silent moons gliding through the darkness, rather than counting numbers. Whatever the reason, tonight, this journey is meant just for you. Right now, you don't need to do anything at all. Simply rest. Allow your breathing to slow down. Let your thoughts soften. And let your body grow lighter, as if gravity itself were gently easing its hold, little by little. And then, very softly, you begin to drift. No rush. No straight path. Only gentle spirals, carrying us away from Earth, past quiet planets, hazy rings of dust, and frozen oceans sleeping beneath deep, endless layers of ice. Stepping away from Earth. As your breathing has slowed and your body no longer needs to keep itself alert, imagine that Earth is now behind you, not leaving in a hurry, but separating ever so gently, like releasing your grip on a daydream. The city lights begin to fade. The soft blue curve of the oceans dissolves into darkness, and the familiar planet becomes a small, quiet point of light, no longer asking you to return just yet. There's no sound here, no wind, no collisions, only a silence so deep that you can feel your own thoughts moving more slowly. You don't need to steer. You don't need to know where you are. Space opens on its own, holding you, carrying you like a weightless current. As Earth drifts farther away, other planets appear not as destinations, but as beings breathing in their own rhythms. There are worlds where atmospheres churn violently, where winds feel nothing like anything we have ever known. There, the air races faster than sound, dragging frozen clouds into endless spirals around a deep blue planet far from warm light. These winds have blown for billions of years, unheard, unobstructed, pure motion of nature itself, relentless and indifferent, and yet, strangely, very peaceful. Elsewhere, muted red stone and dust stretch all the way to the horizon, a dry, silent world where time seems to move more slowly. Giant canyons open like ancient fractures across the planet's surface, so deep that standing at one edge, you could never see the bottom. Water no longer flows there, but the marks of the past remain, telling stories of currents that once existed, patiently carving rock over millions of years before disappearing without farewell. You don't need to linger. You don't need to understand everything. Just drift past, like a passing thought before sleep takes you. Farther still, there is a world wrapped in thick clouds, where sunlight never reaches the surface in familiar ways. Beneath those clouds, the planet turns slowly, very slowly, as if it has nowhere it needs to be. No protective magnetic field, no gentle atmosphere. Only pressure and heat enough to crush anything that ever tried to exist there. And yet, within that harshness, the planet continues to turn, continues along its orbit, without complaint, without pause, a quiet reminder that the universe does not require life in order to go on. As you pass these worlds, your sense of distance begins to change. Numbers lose their meaning. Millions or billions of kilometers no longer need to be counted. Space stops feeling vast and frightening, and becomes instead a gentle emptiness, wide enough that you no longer collide with your thoughts. The sun is still there, but its light is now only a warm presence far away. You're not pulled toward it, nor pushed away. You simply exist between forces in a neutral place where the body is not heavy, and the mind does not need to stay alert. The planets continue to move, not in unison, not to a shared rhythm. Each world keeps its own time. There are places where a single day lasts longer than a year, places where light takes hours to travel from one side to the other. But for you, all these differences begin to dissolve, like distant sounds fading as you sink deeper into sleep. You may sense that you are drifting away, not only from Earth, but from human habits as well. No schedules, no tasks waiting to be done, no questions that need immediate answers, only a gentle state of being, floating, allowed to exist without reason. Space does not ask for your attention. It does not require your understanding. It is simply there, vast, indifferent in a very gentle way. And within that indifference, you are free to let go. If a thought appears, let it pass like a small planet crossing your field of view. No need to follow it. No need to hold on. If your body shifts slightly, allow it to find a more comfortable position, just as celestial bodies slowly adjust their orbits over time. Far away, cold worlds continue to turn in darkness. Winds continue to blow. Canyons remain silent. There is no audience, no witness. And that is perfectly fine. You don't need to stay here long. You don't need to remember everything you've passed. This journey is not meant for remembering, but for lightening. Lighter than when you began. So light that if sleep wishes to arrive right now, you can let it come, without holding on to this story any longer. The universe will continue, whether you listen or not. And you, in this moment, are allowed to rest within its vastness. Strange worlds. As you continue to drift through that quiet expanse, where Earth has faded into a distant memory and movement no longer requires effort, the universe begins to whisper to you in a different way. It is no longer the feeling of leaving, but the feeling of staying. Staying long enough to realize that the strangest things are not exceptions, but the very nature of every world that exists. Far away, in the cold darkness where sunlight is only a faint reminder, enormous planets turn slowly in complete solitude. The pressure there is so immense that matter no longer behaves in familiar ways. Carbon, the element that on Earth becomes life, memory, and meaning, is compressed, transformed, and then falls in silent rain. There is no sound as these crystals form, no gaze to witness them, only pure physical processes repeating over millions of years. Diamonds without value, without symbolism, simply the inevitable result of pressure and time. In that silence, the universe seems to remind you, beauty does not require an observer, and value does not need to be defined. Drifting past these worlds, you may suddenly think of the planet you came from, not because it is ordinary, but because it is strange in its own way. Beneath the thin shell we call the ground, nothing is truly still. Vast plates move slowly, collide, separate, and meet again, like the planet's deepest thoughts. Mountains do not stand still. Oceans do not stay in one place. Everything is moving, only too slowly for humans to feel within a single lifetime. That movement creates continents, creates a stable atmosphere, creates the fragile conditions for life to emerge. And you, in this moment, are a very small part of that chain of motion, stretching back billions of years. Carl Sagan once wrote, "We are a way for the cosmos to know itself." And perhaps, when you think of those immense slabs of rock silently sliding beneath your feet, those words feel gentler than ever. Not as a grand declaration, but as a whisper that human consciousness is simply another phenomenon of the universe, briefly rising on the surface of a living planet. Far from these massive worlds, in places where gravity is so weak you can barely sense its presence, small objects drift through space. They are not large enough to become planets, Yet they are not entirely alone. Some of them carry smaller companions, circling in delicate orbits. There is no majestic order, no complete system, only temporary pairings of motion, held together by a force so slight, yet strong enough to keep them from drifting apart just yet. Looking at them, you may feel a familiar fragility, like human connections, not made to last forever, but real enough to exist for a meaningful while. Closer to the sun, there is a small world that appears dry and sun-scorched. Daytime temperatures grow hot enough to melt metal, while nights become so cold that nearly all motion freezes. And yet, even in this seemingly empty place, something still surrounds it, so thin it almost does not exist. A fragile veil of gas appears and disappears, formed by atoms escaping the surface, lingering only briefly before being swept away. It is not thick enough to protect, not stable enough to endure, but it remains, repeating its cycle of formation and fading without end. An existence like the faintest breath, reminding you that even the weakest things have their own way of being. The universe does not operate according to human comfort. It does not favor stability, nor does it care for convenience. And yet, strangely, within that indifference lies a deep beauty. Rains without skies, motions without witnesses, atmospheres without permanence. All unfolding simply because the laws of physics allow them to. Albert Einstein once said, "The most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious." And perhaps it is that mystery which gently calms your mind. When you no longer need to understand everything, no longer need to explain it all, you are allowed simply to observe, or even not observe at all, letting curiosity exist as a very soft wave. Not one that wakes you, but one that makes you feel a little smaller. As these images begin to blur together, you may realize that curiosity does not have to bring tension with it. It can be gentle, unhurried, like the way planets continue to turn without urgency. You do not need to hold on to information. You do not need to remember names. These strange things are not here to be remembered, but to remind you that the universe is far larger than the thoughts trying to keep you awake. And within that vastness, where every world, large or small, violent or fragile, is allowed to exist in its own way, you are allowed to do the same. Allowed not to understand everything. Allowed to loosen your grip. Allowed to let curiosity slowly dissolve into a soft feeling, gentle enough for sleep to arrive, whenever it chooses to. The sun, source of light and sacrifice. As the strangeness of distant worlds begins to settle, as curiosity no longer urges you to understand more, and instead lingers only as a very gentle echo, the space around you suddenly feels warmer in a way that is difficult to name, not because you are approaching something loud or intense, but because there has always been a source of light here, present even before you began this journey. A presence so familiar that humans rarely pause to truly feel it. At the center of every orbit, every slow movement you have drifted through, there is a star that has been quietly shining for billions of years. It does not shine in order to be seen, nor does it sustain itself for the sake of any life circling around it. It simply does what the laws of physics allow, and in doing so, it gives more than any other object in this region of space. With every passing moment, a very small part of it disappears. Not suddenly, but through a slow, steady wearing away. Almost impossible to notice, unless you know it is happening. Mass is transformed into light, into heat, into energy radiating in all directions. There's no sound, no sign of loss. Only a continuous flow of change, quiet and irreversible. Seen through human eyes, this might be called sacrifice. But to the universe, it is simply process. No intention, no emotion, no hesitation. And because of that, it carries a purity of beauty. A star exists by slowly giving itself away in exchange for stability for everything around it. Deep within its core, where temperature and pressure exceed all familiar imagination, light nuclei fuse together, a process that never stops, never rests. From that fusion, energy is born, then takes thousands of years to travel from the center to the surface, before escaping and continuing its journey through space. The light touching your skin tonight began that journey long ago, long before the recorded history of humankind. Albert Einstein once wrote, "Energy cannot be created or destroyed. It can only be changed from one form to another." Within this star, those words are not an abstract idea, but a reality unfolding every second. Mass becomes energy. Energy becomes light. Light becomes life, becomes weather, becomes biological rhythm, becomes the very feeling of day and night that has been familiar to you since childhood. Strangely, despite giving so much, this star still has an immense amount of time ahead of it. Its lifespan is so vast that a human life is only a blink. Even the entire history of human civilization occupies only a negligible fraction of its existence. It shone before humans learned to look up at the sky, and it will continue to shine long after our worries, ambitions, and stories fade away. Carl Sagan once said something simple yet profound. We are made of star stuff. Not as a metaphor, but literally. The elements that make up your body, every tiny atom holding your form together in this moment, were born in stars. And this nearest star is the source of energy that allows those elements to connect into life, into consciousness, into fatigue, and into the sense of calm you are feeling right now. Thinking of this, the pace of the narration naturally slows. There is no need for more information, no need for more detail, only the feeling that everything you have ever known is part of a process far larger than yourself. The star does not know you, yet you exist because of it. There is no exchange, only a one-way flow, quiet and enduring. Light continues to spread outward, touching other worlds, melting ice in one place, warming atmospheres in another, then gradually weakening as it travels farther still. There is no clear end point, only diffusion, until that energy blends into the vast background warmth of space. And in this moment, as you are listening, that light is still arriving, not hurried, not delayed. It comes exactly as it always has, steady, requiring no attention from you, just like you're breathing right now. No control needed, no thought required. Still continuing on its own. This star too will one day change. Not soon, not within any time you need to concern yourself with. But like everything in the universe, it does not exist forever in the same form. This understanding does not bring unease. Instead, it offers a deep comfort. Because if even the greatest sources of light are allowed to change, then a human being feeling tired, needing rest, needing to let go on a quiet night is all the more natural. You do not need to hold this light in your mind any longer. It will remain, whether you notice it or not. You can allow your thoughts to settle, like the sun slowly lowering beneath the horizon, not disappearing, only slipping temporarily out of view. And in that warm stillness, the narration slows further, deeper, softer, enough that you no longer need to follow this story with alert attention. The universe continues to move, The star continues to shine, and you here are allowed to rest within this long, unbroken flow of time. Ephemeral beauty. As that warm light continues to spread, requiring no one's attention, you may begin to sense that even the things that seem most enduring are moving within a larger current. The source of light remains, yet everything that orbits it is never still. Motion is not an exception. It is the natural state. And within that motion, beauty appears, not because it lasts forever, but because it is changing in every moment. There are sights in the universe that seem as though they have existed since the beginning, familiar enough that humans believe they will always remain. Delicate rings of light surrounding a giant planet, stretching like fine brushstrokes across deep darkness, were once seen as symbols of stability and order. But when viewed more closely, through the lens of long time, you realize that even those perfect circles are slowly dissolving. Particles of ice and rock collide, fall inward, or are drawn away, little by little. There is no dramatic collapse, only a very slow disappearance, slow enough that no one feels alarmed, yet certain enough to be irreversible. One day, those rings will exist only in the memories of beings who once looked up at them. Drifting onward, you may sense another world, where a deep red surface is sometimes completely obscured. There, storms do not bring rain or thunder, but dust, so fine it can envelop an entire planet. They begin gently, almost harmlessly, then spread, linking together until the whole world is wrapped in a haze that lasts for weeks, even months. When this happens, familiar boundaries vanish. Mountains, valleys, horizons, all blend into a single color. And then, when the storms fade, the surface reappears, nearly unchanged, as if nothing had happened. Yet in truth, each time this occurs, the planet becomes slightly different, though it is very hard to notice. Within that repetition, there is a strange rhythm. Not the rhythm of clocks, but the rhythm of impermanence. What covers will dissolve. What dissolves will form again in another way. There is no final state, only phases flowing into one another. Farther still, beneath thick layers of ice that seem utterly still, there are places that are not lifeless at all. There, heat from within quietly melts water, forming dark oceans with no light and no sky. No one sees them directly. No one is certain what exists below. Yet the mere possibility that beneath a frozen shell movement continues is enough to soften the human imagination. Not because of hope for life, but because of the realization that beauty does not always lie in what is visible. Sometimes it exists far below the surface, temporarily hidden, but never gone. There are towering formations of rock, rising higher than anything ever seen on your own planet. They were not created by violent collision, but by slow, persistent accumulation in environments where weaker gravity allows nearly unimaginable structures to exist. They stand there, immense, not to challenge time, but to illustrate another possibility of nature. And then, even these grand structures are not outside the flow. Their surfaces are worn away, not by rain, but by wind and dust, grain by grain, over spans of time so long they are difficult to imagine. As you take in these scenes, you may feel a very gentle sadness, but not a sharp one. Not the sorrow of personal loss, but the soft feeling that comes from realizing nothing needs to be held forever. Everything is passing through its own phase, just like you in this moment. Awake, then asleep, then awake again in a different shape of the day. Carl Sagan once wrote, "Somewhere, something incredible is waiting to be known." But perhaps the incredible lies not only in what we have yet to discover, but in accepting that what we know today will also change. Knowledge, sights, and even the most beautiful symbols are temporary, and that is precisely what makes them precious. Not because they last long, but because they last long enough to be felt. The universe promises permanence to no form. It only allows processes to unfold. Rings dissolve. Storms arrive and pass. Hidden oceans continue to stir in darkness. Towering rocks are slowly worn away. There is no tragedy in this, only continuation. As you let these images pass through your mind, you may notice the urge to hold on beginning to soften. If even the grandest sights do not need to last forever, then a day passing, a feeling settling, or a thought fading is not something to fear. It is simply the way things have always moved. The pace of the narration does not need to quicken now, nor does it need more detail. It can simply slow, allowing each image enough space to dissolve into the next, without clear boundaries. You do not need to remember names. You do not need to keep order. These beauties are not here to be recorded, but to remind you that change is not the enemy of peace. And as awareness gently softens, you can allow this sense of impermanence to become a comfort. That nothing needs to be fixed. That no moment needs to last longer than its natural span. Everything is allowed to arrive and allowed to leave. Within that permission, your body too is allowed to grow heavier, then lighter in its own rhythm. Sleep, if it comes, is not a loss, only another phase of existence. Brief, necessary, and beautiful in its own quiet way. Fragility and subtlety. As those delicate beauties slowly dissolve into the wider flow of time, as your awareness grows accustomed to not holding on to any form for too long, the universe seems to begin whispering in an even more subtle way. No longer through grand motions or easily recognized transformations, but through the finest, lightest details, things that only reveal themselves when the pace is slow enough, when the mind is soft enough to listen. There are structures in space that appear majestic from afar, wide and radiant, as if they carry an unshakable strength within them. Yet if you draw closer, if you look not with the naked eye, but with the patience of science, you discover that they are so thin, they almost do not exist. These bands of matter, though stretching hundreds of thousands of kilometers, are only as thick as a sheet of paper. They persist not because of solidity, but because of a fragile balance between gravity and motion. A very small change, and their shape would no longer be the same. Within that fragility lies a quiet beauty, like a delicate line held in place not by force, but by harmony. Drifting away from those thin bands, you may sense a familiar world in an entirely different way. A planet unremarkable in size, unimpressive in distance, yet possessing an astonishing density. Everything there is compressed, gathered, held tightly together. Mountains, oceans, metals, stone, and life, all existing within a space far smaller than many of the worlds you have passed. Strong gravity keeps everything in place, preventing it from dispersing. And it is precisely this density that creates the familiar feeling of weight, of standing on solid ground, of sensing that your body has a clear and defined form. There is a gentle contrast between the drifting fragility of those thin bands and the compact intensity of that dense world. One exists through extreme lightness, the other through uncompromising cohesion. Yet both arise from the same set of laws, within the same universe that favors neither one over the other. In that contrast, science ceases to be dry numbers and becomes a kind of poetry. where opposites coexist, complementing one another without the need for explanation. At the center of all these motions, there's a source of light that seems unchanging. And yet, even that stability is only relative. That familiar star is not truly still. It oscillates, vibrates, very gently, very steadily, like the deep breathing of molten matter. These vibrations travel outward and return again, forming rhythms that humans cannot hear with ordinary ears, but can sense through contemplation. If you could listen in another way, you would realize that space is not completely silent. It carries slow, deep pulses, like a wordless song being sung for billions of years. Galileo Galilei once wrote, "Mathematics is the language with which God has written the universe." But perhaps alongside the language of numbers, there exists another language, the language of rhythm, oscillations, vibrations, repeating cycles that require no listener. They exist not to be perceived, but because matter, when it exists, cannot be entirely still. Thinking about this, you may feel a very gentle sense of comfort. Even the greatest sources of light vibrate. Even the structures that seem most permanent are more fragile than they appear. And even the densest worlds are simply another way for matter to arrange itself. In this moment, you do not need to understand how those oscillations are measured or why they occur. You only need to allow the idea that the universe is not a cold machine, but something continuously resonating at different frequencies, from powerful to nearly imperceptible. These vibrations do not tear things apart. They keep everything alive. Like you're breathing right now, no conscious control required, still steady, still enough to sustain your body. You do not need to intervene. You do not need to adjust. You can simply allow the rhythm to continue. As your mind lingers with these fragile and subtle things, the urge to hold on to information begins to dissolve. You do not need to remember details. You do not need to keep clear images. The thin bands, the dense world, and the deep vibrations can blend together, becoming a very light background sensation, enough to satisfy curiosity without making you more alert. Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote, "Be patient toward all that is unsolved in your heart." Perhaps science invites that same patience. Not patience to find answers immediately, but patience to remain with subtlety, with things that are quiet, unassuming. The universe is not made only of grand events. It is also woven from details that are thin, light, and easily overlooked. And it is precisely these details that form the deep structure of everything you are experiencing. As the pace slows even further, you can allow these images to blur, not disappearing, simply dissolving into the quiet background behind them. Your body may feel heavier or lighter. Both are fine. There is no correct state. There is no demand. Within this subtlety, science no longer stands opposite poetry. They merge as two different ways of speaking about the same reality. And in this moment, you do not need to distinguish between them. You only need to be here, listening, and allowing yourself to drift deeper into the stillness that is gently opening. Unusual motions, as those subtle vibrations fade into the background of stillness as you stop trying to distinguish what is movement and what is silence. The universe opens another layer of motion. Quiet, unexplained, yet gentle enough to soften every familiar habit of thought. Here, movement no longer follows human intuition. It unfolds in its own way, slow and consistent with itself, even when it seems to contradict everything we were taught to expect. There is a world that turns in a direction unlike most others. Not because it chose to be different, but because its history was written by ancient collisions, moments when matter was pushed off course and never returned to what it once was. On its surface, the sun rises where we would not expect, and sets where we once believed beginnings should be. A day there is so long that a single rotation no longer feels like a rhythm, but like an extended state, almost motionless. When you look at this movement, you may sense that ideas of right and wrong exist only when there is an observer. For the universe, there are only orbits, and orbits carry no opinions. Farther out, there is a giant whose gravity is strong enough to draw an entire community of smaller worlds along with it. They are not alike. They do not line up neatly. They do not follow a single pattern. Some moons are stretched by tidal forces. Some are covered in ice. Some bear the marks of volcanoes that never stop erupting. They turn, drift out of phase, interact, sometimes exchanging positions over long spans of time. If you try to force a simple order onto them, you will be disappointed. But if you allow yourself to drift with them, you may notice something else. Diversity does not require uniformity in order to exist. A system can be stable without being tidy. Isaac Asimov once wrote, "The most exciting phrase to hear in science, the one that heralds new discoveries, is not eureka, but that's funny." Perhaps it is this sense of strangeness that opens the door to deeper relaxation. When you allow yourself not to understand right away, not to organize everything immediately, the mind begins to loosen. Unusual motions no longer create tension. They become reminders that the world does not need to fit your expectations in order to keep moving. Closer to the source of light, where temperature differences grow so extreme that softness seems impossible, there are places of permanent darkness. There, light never reaches, and within that darkness, ice endures, patient and persistent. It does not melt. It does not disappear. It simply remains, a quiet paradox within an intensely heated region. Thinking of this, you may sense that even places which seem least suitable still find their own way to preserve what is fragile. No ideal conditions required, only enough stability in their own way. These motions are not designed to make humans comfortable. They do not follow work schedules. They do not align with biological cycles. They do not fit clocks or calendars. And precisely because of that, they offer a gentle sense of release. When you realize that the universe does not revolve around your needs, you are allowed to stop trying to control. Albert Einstein once said, "The most incomprehensible thing about the universe is that it is comprehensible." But perhaps just as important is accepting that some parts do not need to be comprehensible right now. There is no need to turn every motion into a diagram. No need to force every orbit into a tidy story. As you let these images pass, a world spinning backward, a diverse community of moons, a region of ice surviving in darkness, you may notice that the unease once attached to strangeness begins to soften. In its place comes a gentler curiosity, unhurried, a form of attention without tension. The universe does not break rules. It simply does not know the rules humans use to feel safe. And in refusing to cater to our intuition, it offers a quiet lesson. Order does not have to look the way we expect. Stability does not have to be easy to understand. And peace does not need to come from familiarity. As the pace of the narration continues to slow, these unusual motions no longer stand out as separate images. They blend together, becoming a deep, steady background movement, like ocean currents far below the surface, always present, never needing to be seen to continue. You do not need to carry away any conclusions. You do not need to extract a clear lesson. Simply allow the feeling that the universe is larger than every rule humans have ever created, and that this realization makes letting go easier. Within that space, as orbits continue to drift out of phase and paradoxes continue to exist without conflict, you too are allowed to drift away from your usual rhythm, allowed not to meet expectations, allowed to rest without a reasonable explanation. And if sleep arrives while these motions are still unfolding far away, that is perfectly fine. The universe will continue turning in its own way. You do not need to witness it. You only need to drift, gently, slowly, and unbound by any rule other than the deepening rhythm of your own breath. Ice worlds and hidden oceans. As those unfamiliar motions continue without any need for human witness, as your sense of familiar orders softens enough that it no longer keeps you awake, space seems to expand once more. Not upward or downward, but in a subtler way, by gently shrinking what you once considered the center. Here, there are no grand events demanding attention, only distance, cold, and a very slow rhythm of existence, slow enough that the ego no longer clings to its sense of importance. At the distant edge of familiar space, there is a small world so cold that sunlight is little more than a faded memory. Its surface bears cracks, alternating light and dark regions, resembling a heart etched into ice and stone. Yet that still exterior hides something else, deep beneath the thick ice, where there is no sky and no day or night. Water can still exist in liquid form, not because of warmth, but because pressure and internal heat are just enough to keep it from freezing entirely. An ocean that does not need light, does not need attention, quietly moving in the dark. Thinking of this, you may feel a deep sense of humility, that life, or at least conditions close to it, does not need to be displayed in order to exist. That what matters is not always found on the surface. Carl Sagan once wrote, "The universe is not required to be in perfect harmony with human ambition." Perhaps these cold worlds are the gentlest reminder of that truth. They exist not to serve human curiosity, but because the laws of physics allow them to exist. Whether they carry meaning or not depends entirely on the observer. And in this moment, you do not need to assign them any meaning at all. As you continue drifting through this region of space, you might imagine an area once thought to be crowded, packed with constantly colliding rocks. But when you look more closely, when distance is measured as it truly is, it reveals itself as an immense emptiness. Small objects separated by almost unimaginable spans, rarely meeting, rarely colliding. From afar, it appears dense. From within, it is nearly void. A gentle paradox, reminding you that what seems crowded is sometimes only a matter of perspective. There is something deeply comforting in that emptiness. Not every space needs to be filled. Not every gap is a lack. Sometimes, emptiness is what allows motion without collision, what allows orbits to exist without conflict. Within that sparseness, the ego, so used to occupying space and asserting itself, begins to shrink, not through force, but because it is no longer necessary. Farther still, there is a planet that does not rotate in the way you would expect. Its axis is tilted so extremely that it does not spin upright, but almost rolls around its central source of light. Day and night do not divide evenly. Seasons stretch, overlap, and change in ways unfamiliar to habitual thinking. But to the universe, this is not abnormal. It is simply another configuration of motion, stable in its own way. There is no right or wrong, only different ways of existing within the same field of forces. Albert Einstein once said, "Reality is merely an illusion albeit a very persistent one. Looking at these worlds, an icy planet with a hidden ocean, a region that seems crowded but is mostly empty, a world tilted beyond belief. Those words no longer feel like abstract philosophy. They become something directly experienced. What you once called intuition was only habit. And when that habit loosens, reality expands. In that expansion, you do not need to do anything. You do not need to understand everything. You do not need to remember names or numbers. These worlds are not here to test memory, but to soften the sense that everything must revolve around you. When you realize that the universe is filled with unseen oceans and untouched emptiness, letting go of personal worries becomes easier. Space is no longer a backdrop for human stories. It is a vast, neutral presence, unbiased and unassuming. And within that neutrality, you are freed from the need to be important. No need to leave a mark. No need to be remembered. Only to exist briefly among structures that have existed for a very long time and will continue long after you fall asleep. As you let these images drift by, your sense of self may grow lighter, smaller, yet never vanish.